Okay, so you're knee-deep in articles about these XPath and CSS selectors, and what you really need is like the fastest way to know which one is the right one for your, web automation and testing projects.
Yeah, that's a common challenge I hear a lot. It's like you've got this mountain of information, but what you need is like a clear path forward. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So think of this as your like fast track to clarity.
All that.
So when we talk about web automation, like locating these elements reliably, it's really the foundation of everything, isn't it?
Absolutely. It really is. It's like think of element locators as like GPS coordinates, but for the stuff you need to interact with on a web page.
Okay.
So whether you're doing test automation or you're scraping data or dealing with all this dynamic content that's all over the web, or even if you're focused on making sure your website is accessible and it works across all those different browsers out there like Chrome and Firefox and Safari.
Yeah.
Being able to zero in on those specific elements is like non-negotiable.
So it's the core.
It's fundamental.
Yeah. Yeah. And the two main players we hear about all the time are XPath and CSS selectors.
Right.
XPath, XML path language. Originally it was for XML.
Yeah.
But now it's used to navigate the structure of HTML.
Yeah.
And then you've got CSS selectors, which started as a way to style websites.
Right.
But they've really evolved into a powerful way to locate those elements.
Yeah, they've become surprisingly sophisticated.
Yeah, so our mission in this deep dive is to kind of break down the complexity of this and extract the key differences between these two.
Absolutely.
We'll look at the performance implications, the best ways to use them, and even kind of like tap into what the community's saying about them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like what are people actually experiencing out there in the real world?
Right. So our goal is really to equip you, the listener, with a clear understanding of when to use XPath and when CSS selectors will be the better choice.
I like it.
Okay, so let's dive into like the core functionality here. So XPath, XML path language, it sounds a little bit intimidating.
It does have a bit of a like technical ring to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, but what's the real power that it gives someone who's using it?
Well, the fascinating thing about XPath is that it's incredibly flexible. And that flexibility comes from its roots in XML. XML is very structured. It's like a tree with branches and all these relationships. So XPath gives you all these comprehensive ways to navigate that structure.
Okay.
You're not just limited to going like down the tree from parent to child. You can actually go up to parent elements. You can move across to siblings, and you can even go all the way back up to ancestors.
Oh.
And on top of that, it has some really powerful text-based selection capabilities.
Okay.
So there are these functions built into XPath, like contains or starts with, that allow you to find elements based on the actual text content that they hold.
Right.
So if you need to find like a specific button that has the word submit in it, XPath often gives you the most direct way to do that.
So it sounds like it can get pretty granular and very specific.
Oh, it could definitely get super specific.
Okay. Now CSS selectors, on the other hand, they feel a little bit more direct.
Yeah, they're a bit more straightforward in a way.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, they were originally designed for styling.
Right.
So their main strength is selecting elements based on those kind of core HTML building blocks.
Yeah.
The tags, the IDs, the classes, the attributes, that kind of stuff.
And it's evolved a lot over time.
It really has.
Yeah.
CSS now has all these ways to match attributes, not just for exact matches, but you can find attributes that start with a certain value and with a certain value, or even contain a specific value anywhere within the attribute.
It gives you a lot more flexibility than just matching exact attribute
Oh,
values.
a ton more flexibility.
Yeah. And then there are also things like combinators and pseudo classes, right?
Right, exactly. So those combinators are really useful. Think about like the plus sign, the plus symbol that lets you select an element that comes immediately after another one, or the tilde, which lets you select any sibling element that comes after another one.
Oh.
And then you've got those pseudo classes, like you mentioned, hover or checked. These are like states of elements, whether you're hovering over it with the mouse or if a checkbox is checked or not.
Right.
And then you have these really powerful ones called structural pseudoclasses, like nth child, which lets you target elements based on their position within their parent. So you can say like, give me the second list item, or give me every other list item, that kind of thing. So they may seem simple at first, but there's a lot of depth there.
Yeah. So just to kind of like give a concrete comparison.
Yeah.
So you're looking for a specific button on a page.
Right.
XPath might allow you to say, find the button that's a child of this particular section, and that section contains the text details.
Okay.
Whereas CSS might say, find the button with this ID or this class name.
Yeah, that's a really good way to visualize it. XPath is often focused on the relationships between elements and sometimes the actual content of those elements, whereas CSS is often more focused on the inherent properties of the elements themselves. The tag, the ID, the class, the attribute.
Okay, so it's a different way of thinking about it.
It's a different mental model.
Let's make this a little more concrete with some basic syntax examples.
Sure.
For both of these.
Absolutely. So for XPath, a very fundamental example is 2 forward slashes followed by the tag name.
Yeah.
So like button.
Okay.
That would select all the button elements on the page for you. Okay. To find an element with a particular attribute and its value, you'd use something like button, and then in square brackets at attribute value. So you're basically saying, find a button where the attribute has this specific value.
Right.
And then for selecting based on text, like we talked about, you could use tag name, and then in square brackets, text content. So you're saying, find a tag where the text content is this exact phrase.
Got it. And those seem pretty straightforward.
Yeah, they're relatively intuitive.
Now, what about CSS syntax?
So for CSS, just the tag name by itself will do the same thing as that basic XPath example.
Okay.
So just button would select all the buttons. To select an element by its ID, use a hash symbol followed by the ID. So hashtag my button, for example. And for selecting by class, it's a dot followed by the class name. So dot my class, for instance. And selecting by attribute looks like this. In square brackets, you have attribute value. So you're saying find an element where this attribute has this exact value.
Got it. So, you can see there's some overlap in what they can achieve.
Definitely.
But the way you express those targets is different.
The syntax is different, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about performance, because that's always a big concern.
It's top of mind, right?
Yeah. And CSS selectors, they're generally considered faster.
Right.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so when you look at benchmark tests, they consistently show that CSS selectors tend to have faster execution times.
Okay.
And this is often cited as being up to like 30% quicker. And a big reason for that is that browsers have built-in support and optimization specifically for CSS selector engines because they need those to render web pages efficiently. To apply all the styles and make the pages look the way they do. XPath, on the other hand, often involves a bit more complex parsing of the document structure. So it takes a little bit longer for the browser to process those XPath queries.
Now, we have a performance table here that kind of illustrates this.
Okay.
Can you walk us through what we're seeing here?
Absolutely. So if we look at an ID-based CSS selector, we see really quick execution times. In optimal conditions, they're typically in like the 1 to 2 millisecond range, averaging around 2 to 3 milliseconds. And even in like the worst cases, they usually stay within 4 to 5 milliseconds.
So really fast.
Super fast. Class-based CSS is also quite efficient, typically ranging from about 2 to 3 milliseconds up to maybe 7 or 8 milliseconds. Now, when we look at XPath, even a simple XPath query takes a little bit longer. Best case times are around 3 to 4 milliseconds, and they could potentially go up to like 8 to 10 milliseconds in less ideal scenarios.
Okay.
And then for more complex XPath queries where you're chaining a lot of conditions together or doing more intricate selections, those execution times increase further. Best case, maybe 5 to 6 milliseconds, but in the worst case, you could be looking at like 12 to 15 milliseconds. So on paper, CSS definitely looks like the faster option.
Right. So based on these numbers, CSS looks like the clear winner in terms of speed.
It does appear that way.
But I've also noticed a lot of discussion in the community about whether this difference is really significant in real-world usage.
Yeah, that's an important point.
Is it actually noticeable?
A lot of experienced developers and QA engineers point out that in the grand scheme of a web application's overall performance,
right,
when you factor in things like network latency, how well your tests are designed, the complexity of the web page itself, those tiny differences in milliseconds might not actually be that noticeable for most practical purposes.
So the end user experience might not be significantly impacted by which one you choose in most cases?
Exactly. In many cases, it's not going to make a huge difference.
Okay.
But there is one major exception.
Okay.
And this is relevant if you're working with older systems. Older browsers, particularly Internet Explorer. Because IE's native XPath engine wasn't as optimized as the ones in modern browsers, you could see a much more substantial performance impact when using XPath in those environments.
Yeah.
So if your work involves supporting those legacy browsers, that's a really crucial consideration.
Okay, that's a really important point. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about best practices.
Okay, sounds good.
What are some of the things that people should keep in mind, both in terms of what to do and what not to do when they're using these locators?
Yeah, so one of the key best practices is to really encourage the use of semantic IDs and classes by your development team. If your crucial elements have meaningful and unique identifiers, your locators are going to be much more stable and much easier to understand and maintain.
Right. And this is something I've seen come up a lot, the recommendation to use data attributes.
Yeah, data attributes are super helpful.
Can you explain the benefit of those?
Yeah, so these attributes like data tested are specifically for your testing hooks. They're not tied to the visual styling or the functionality of the application. So they're less likely to change due to like design updates or feature changes,
Oh, okay.
which makes your tests a lot more resilient over time.
So that makes them more reliable.
Exactly. And it's also a good idea to keep your selectors as simple as possible. Don't create these overly long and complex chains of selectors if you can target the element more directly. And regular maintenance is essential. When the application changes, your selectors might break. So you need to have a process for updating them.
So that maintenance is really key. It's super important. And documenting your selector strategies, especially for those more intricate patterns, can save you a ton of time and frustration down the road.
It's like leaving breadcrumbs for yourself.
It really is. And here's another actionable insight. Even if your development team isn't automatically adding these data-tested attributes, consider a collaborative approach where your QA team can strategically introduce them maybe as part of your testing workflow.
Oh, so like a proactive approach.
Exactly.
Okay. What about the things to avoid? What are some of the anti-patterns?
One of the biggest pitfalls is relying on absolute XPath paths.
Okay.
These are very long and very specific paths through the HTML structure, and they're incredibly fragile. Even a small change in the layout of the page can break them.
Okay.
Similarly, try to minimize your reliance on index-based selection, like selecting the third link in a list.
All right.
If the order of those elements changes, your selector is no longer valid.
It's going to break.
Yeah.
And overly complex selectors, where you're chaining multiple conditions together unnecessarily, can also lead to instability and potential performance issues.
Okay.
And while it's not always feasible if you can aim for consistency by primarily using either CSS selectors or XPath within a single test suite, that can often improve the overall maintainability and reduce the cognitive load for you and your team.
So consistency can be a huge advantage.
It really can.
Yeah. Now, what about specific automation frameworks?
Okay.
Are there any recommendations or trends that are specific to different frameworks?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So modern testing frameworks often have their own preferred strategies.
Okay.
For example, Playwright really emphasizes role-based selectors, which try to identify elements based on their purpose, like a button or a checkbox, rather than their underlying HTML implementation.
Okay.
And they also heavily advocate for using tested attributes. Cypress also champions using data-C attributes
Okay.
as a best practice for test selectors, and even provides ways for you to create your own custom selector commands. Selenium, which has been around for a long time, supports various selector types. But their general recommendation now is to lean towards CSS selectors.
Because of the performance?
Yeah, because of the performance and the broad browser compatibility. Even frameworks like Test Cafe offer custom selector extensions, so they give you more control and flexibility in how you locate elements.
So it sounds like the more modern frameworks are kind of trending towards favoring CSS selectors and specific attribute-based strategies.
Yeah, there's definitely a movement in that direction.
Okay. Now, what about the community? What are developers and QA engineers actually saying about using XPath versus CSS in their day-to-day work?
Well, it's interesting because the community discussions really highlight that the choice isn't always black and white.
Okay.
Like we mentioned earlier, a lot of developers have a strong preference for CSS selectors, and a big reason is simply familiarity. They use CSS for styling, so it's already part of their workflow. However, some experienced QA engineers point out that this preference might sometimes come from a lack of deep experience with XPath and not fully understanding its capabilities.
So it's almost like they haven't been exposed to the full power of it?
Exactly. And there are automation experts who argue that being skilled in both and knowing when to apply each effectively is the mark of a truly well-rounded automation engineer.
So it's not about picking one or the other. It's about knowing when to use the right tool for the job.
Exactly. Dismissing one entirely might just show a lack of experience with different types of applications and challenges.
Now, the discussion around data attributes seems to be pretty lively in the community as well.
That's a hot topic.
What are the different perspectives there?
So while there's a general agreement that data attributes are ideal in theory, for creating more stable tests, the reality can be more complex. especially when you're working with older systems or third-party components where you don't have control over the HTML structure. But we've seen some creative workarounds discussed, like QA teams adding those attributes themselves and then having developers review the changes.
So it's like they're taking the initiative to kind of bridge that gap.
Exactly. It's a pragmatic way to make things work.
And it seems like when it comes to performance, the community's experience generally aligns with what we discussed earlier.
Yeah. Okay.
Benchmarks give you a starting point, but the actual impact on your test suite's performance might be minimal in many cases.
Right.
With that important caveat for older browsers.
Right. Exactly. Most people are saying that the difference between well-written CSS selectors and XPath selectors is often negligible in their day-to-day work.
So to summarize, it doesn't sound like one is definitively better than the other.
Okay.
It's more about making informed choices based on the context of your work.
Exactly.
So CSS selectors, they offer that speed and simplicity, which makes them a great default choice for a lot of modern web applications.
Right.
And the familiarity for front-end developers is a big plus. But XPath has that flexibility and power. You know, those features that make it really useful for more complex scenarios or those legacy systems where the HTML structure might not be as predictable.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So would you recommend kind of like a hybrid approach in a lot of situations?
In many cases, yes.
You know, use CSS for the simple selections and turn to XPath when you need that extra power.
I think that's a really sensible strategy. Understand the strengths of each, and then you can apply them strategically.
So it's about choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
And knowing both of them gives you more options.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this whole landscape of web applications and automation is constantly evolving.
Oh, yeah.
New features are being added to both CSS selectors and XPath. And the recommendations from the frameworks you're using, they might change over time too.
So you got to stay up to date.
Staying informed is key.
So as we wrap this up, here's a final thought for you, the listener. Given how complex web applications are becoming,
Yeah.
and the growing use of AI in automation, right?
How do you think this balance between XPath and CSS selectors might change in the future?
That's a good question.
Which one might be better suited to handle those really unforeseen complexities or those brand new web architectures that we haven't even encountered yet?
Yeah, it's something to ponder.
It's something to think about as you continue on your journey in web automation.
Absolutely.
Thanks for diving deep with us.